Well, being born in Israel or Palestine, as I said before, to both parents who come from the Middle East, both my parents were born in Palestine, and they simply implanted in us the love and knowledge of the Arabic language. I had Arabic at home, although my first language was, or my mother tongue was Hebrew, but Arabic was the second language spoken at home. And all my brothers and sisters following this example, meaning that we both love the Arabic culture, the Arabic language, etc. So this is the background.
When was that? When was that?
Well, from back from
which years? Which
I was born in 1940, so you can tell
1940s.
how old I am. But since my first day, I remember hearing Arabic. We only spoke Arabic to my grandmother. She knew Hebrew, but she preferred to talk Arabic. She was born in Safad, and I am, as a matter of fact, on my mother's side, a 10th generation of a Palestinian Jew. Certainly, I think that I belong to a small group of unusual people with a background of being born in Israel, what we call Sabras, and at the same time come or originate in a family or from a family which is also Palestinian. Usually you're talking about one or two generations. In my case, as I said, 10th generation in Israel. So those species are quite rare in Israel, as far as I know. So most of my friends who know Arabic or heard Arabic at home are immigrants who came over from Arab states and lived in Israel. The present generation was born there, as a second or third, even third generation now. But the parents of most of my friends were not born in Palestine. Still they came from other Arab countries. So they speak their own dialects, so to speak. Well, when I first, as I said, I started to learn Arabic as a child at home and then at school, from which I moved to the university, to the Hebrew University. I had my first and second degrees from the Hebrew University in Arabic studies and also Hebrew studies. It was mainly Arabic. And then I came over to Cambridge to do my Ph.D. at Cambridge University and started teaching Hebrew here, modern Hebrew. And soon afterwards, I was asked to offer some supervisions in Arabic in the Palestinian dialect, because at Cambridge there were different, people who spoke different dialects, and I was approached to offer some supervisions in Arabic. And from there, I moved up to Leeds to teach the Arabic language, because Leeds decided to concentrate on the Arabic language. When I was in Leeds, I started to have many students from Arab lands who came over to do higher degrees, PhDs in particular, in our department, and I encouraged them. And the contact with these students was wonderful, was very creative and very. You must remember from your times there that we used to have many students from Arab lands. They came with some suspicion, I must admit, because they couldn't see themselves being taught by a Jew or by an ex-Israeli. You see, this was a bit some kind of suspicion going on there. But soon it disappeared, especially because they found out that I spoke their language. I could still offer them some knowledge of their own language, especially a background of Arabic grammar and some literature and so on and so forth. So they immediately, this suspicion just disappeared. And friendship developed, absolutely friendship. So we are still in touch. Most of my ex-students are in touch with me. The same thing happened when I was asked to examine PhDs on behalf of other universities. And in some cases, I became very friendly, very close friend to some of my ex-examinees, if you can say it. And so the contacts were very warm, and nice, creative, without any suspicion. And I think that the closeness between Jews and Arabs could prove to be very constructive and very firm. And my very simple theory is that we are not divided by the past, we are divided by politics. And the reason is that different sources, different elements penetrated this area and caused a lot of damage to the relations between Jews and Arabs. There is no doubt to me that there must be peace in the future, and I'm sure that the Arabs and Jews will learn to live and to exist together. That's right. Yes, Arabic was but also the past in many respects, the culture. We're talking about culture in general. I don't know if anybody can define the word culture or the concept culture clearly, but broadly speaking, the culture is very similar between the Oriental Jews and the Arabs or Muslim Arabs, because we have the same customs, the same beliefs, the same past in many respects. And therefore, there's not just the language. The language is a very strong element, of course, of this is the kind of glue between us. But at the same time, we share lots and lots of things from the culture. It's not always the case. I think that I regard myself as a bridge between the two entities here. Those who are coming, the Jews who come from not from Arab lands, but from Europe instead, or some other parts, who know nothing about the Arab culture and heritage. And this goes to also to for the people who came over to Palestine before the State of Israel was created, who knew nothing about the culture, about the neighbors who were living there. And therefore it created obviously some tensions which grew up thanks, in inverted commas, to politics, who complicated matters much more. Nationalism, etc., versus Zionism, and so on and so forth. But I think that I feel at home in Arab culture, as well as what we may call now Israeli culture. Although I don't live there, I live in England. But I have got my connections, links, family ties, and etc., etc. So I don't think that there's a very wide gap between the two. It's just what we should expect is more understanding of the other. And this will, if once we understand each other, then I'm sure that all the other elements which divide us will dissolve, will disappear. The Geniza means a collection of a Judeo-Arabic, mainly Judeo-Arabic documents found in an old synagogue in Cairo. The synagogue was built in the 9th century AD, and then 1,000 years later, some documents surfaced, and a person from Cambridge at the time, Dr. Taylor-Shechter, went to Egypt and brought all this wonderful collection comprising 140,000 documents at Cambridge. On top of it, we have got about the same number of documents scattered in 19 other centers around the world, including Russia and America and some other places. So we have all been working on this material since its removal to Cambridge, which took place in 1897. And more than 100 years, scholars from all around the world are working on this collection. Now, what do we find in this collection? Briefly, everything, which means correspondence and fragments of old books and old works by famous writers, famous personalities of the Middle Ages. The Geniza covers 1,000 years, but we're basically working on the four centuries, from the 9th century, 8th century if you like, but 9th century to the 13th century, which is a very broad period of time. But this is the bulk of the interesting stuff there. As I mentioned, some personalities, or without mentioning names, but among those we find Maimonides, some parts of works of Maimonides, but the most important element in the Geniza are those documents which are correspondence. People writing to people about lots of things. And the correspondence didn't take part only inside Egypt per se, but all around the known world of the time, which means from Morocco today to India and even beyond all these borders. And the correspondence is valuable because it tells us so much about the Jews and Arabs' relations. Jews lived inside or under the rule of Islam. Yet what we find, and it is reflected in the Geniza documents as well as our writings, that the Jews lived in relatively very peaceful time under the Muslim regime or government. Some of them reached very high positions in the system, in the whole system. People were appointed as medical doctors. For example, Maimonides himself was a medical doctor of one of the caliphs, Saladin. People took positions as ministers of finances, etc. So they played a very important role within the Muslim empire. The relations had ups and downs, as we all know, as it happens among minorities and the ruling majority. So there were times that they were very hard or harsh times, and there were times which were of pleasure and very pleasant times. It all depended on the ruler himself. You can't say that the whole dynasty was rejected the Jews or hated the Jews or whatever. A certain person who came to power took a very negative attitude towards the Jews, suspicious Jews. Whether it was based on some facts of the time, we don't always know. But in general, that's what happened. On the other hand, there were long periods of peace, of coexistence, of collaboration, and as we see from the Geniza itself, life was not as bad as even today, which is very, very interesting. I found it a very interesting point in history, where in the past, in the Middle Ages, Jews lived in much more a peaceful life, in much more quiet times than they are today. And unfortunately, what we see today is we all read about it in the press or hear the media reporting about it.
Avihai Shivtiel, thank you very much.
Thank you.